What I'm going to talk about today is since I've retired, I started studying retirement and trying to figure out what do I need to do in retirement to make sure that I have a fulfilling retirement. I'm not going to talk about finances at all, but I went through the literature, which I'm going to show you in a bit, and came up with a process, which is, I think, a reasonable structure that applies broadly and will help people create a better retirement. So who am I? I was trained as an engineer, then I went to medical school. I had a solo private medical practice for 32 years. In the process, I created one of the first electronic medical record programs. You know, when you walk in, you see Epic or whatever. I was doing that back in 1989, 1990. And as a result of that, I was a health IT geek, writing articles in magazines before there was the web, and then on the web and going to conferences, trying to push the national health information technology agenda in a certain direction. I didn't succeed, but I had fun doing it. Anyway, in 2019, I closed my private practice and became an employed physician. The healthcare system has changed and private practice is pretty much going away. And then I formally retired in December. And I'll talk more about that in a second. In June, I wrote this article, Approaching Retirement, which is on my blog, ihaveanidea.us, and then became an employed physician. Now, at about this time, the healthcare system really started to change for me. Working in private practice was one thing. Working under administration that basically says, we know how you should run your practice and so forth, that created a lot of ethical problems for me, because there was a conflict between what the bureaucracy said how the office needed to be run and what I knew I needed so I could take care of my patients. And many times I found myself in the position of, this is not right. I can't take care of these patients properly because of the bureaucracy. When I go to the hospital, the senior hospital administrators, I can't get them to do what I need. And ultimately, this engendered a tremendous amount of stress. And I wrote about this on my essay called Moral Injury, which I'll also get to later. About a year before all this, I had scheduled a trip to go backpacking in Alaska. And I went to a place called Wrangell St. Elias National Park, which is in the southeast corner of Alaska, just above the Panhandle. It's the largest national park in the US. It is 6 times the size of Yellowstone. There are no roads, there are no trails. A plane flies you in, drops you off on a dried lake bed or a field, and they come back a couple of days later, hopefully, and pick you up. And that's the only way to get in or out of this place. So I was on an REI trip, and we were in the backcountry. I think it was 3 or 4 nights, I don't remember. And we were doing this spectacular hike. So we started hiking way off in the distance, and we're walking up this valley. And behind me is a mountain pass, sort of like you see up here, except there wasn't a glacier on top. And we hiked up the mountain pass, and I turned around, and you've got these 2 rows of granite mountains going down both sides. On top of the mountains, you've got glaciers, and down the middle of this valley is this river with necklace with bright green and floral colors. When I got to the top of the mountain pass, the whole world looked different. All of a sudden, all the stress that I was living under just disappeared. And I turned to the person next to me and I said to them, I'm going to quit my job. I got back to my tent that night. I was in a one-man tent. I dictated a note into my phone. We have no cell phone service out there, obviously. When I got back, I sent the email to Gail and said, look, this is what I'm thinking. She wrote back, I told you to quit your job. You're out completely stressed out. Go ahead and quit. And I sent it off to my boss. And that's when I wrote my article, My Journey into Retirement, and came up with a mantra, it is now my time. And Gail referred to earlier that moment of cognitive clarity. That's my moment of cognitive clarity, top of that mountain pass. So I'm now retired and I'm 68. What am I going to do? On the right are the life expectancy calculators. And I have 2 or 3 decades left, assuming the best. And so what am I going to do with my time? Now, life is divided up into stages, and really only recently, in the last 150 years, has a whole concept of retiring actually occurred. Before then, people worked until they couldn't. Starting in 1880 and then maybe again in 1910, they started to have real pension plans and people planning for retirement. But the whole concept of retirement was basically a new one. In this situation, I've got to think about how I'm going to move forward. And Daniel Gilbert, who's a professor of psychology at Harvard, had talked about how humans think that where they are at the moment is really, as adults, is going to be where they are in the future. And that's not the case. We are constantly evolving, our relationship with our spouse evolving and our interests. And I sort of said, okay, I need to try to create a plan. So I started doing research into retirement. And the first thing is I've learned there are 4 stages of retirement. First stage is vacation or honeymoon, and that lasts variably 6 months, a year or 2. The second stage is disenchantment, boredom, or loss of identity, purpose, friends, or for some people, power. And I was thinking of retirement, it was like, oh, do I really want to give up my identity as a physician? And that was something that I thought about a lot. And I'm sure everybody who has a position that helps identify themselves in their own mind to the rest of the world, they're reluctant to move beyond that. So that's stage 2, disenchantment, boredom, or loss. Stage 3, which not everybody progresses to, are those who start to explore what all the alternatives through the process of trial and error. Stage 4 is those groups of people who find a new purpose, enlightenment, nirvana, rebirth, where they now have a new purpose in life, and that they stay with for the end. So the second study I looked into was the Harvard study of adult development. This is a remarkable clinical trial. Started out in 1938, where a group of researchers at Harvard decided they wanted to follow a group of then sophomores for the long term and see what happens to them over the course of their lives. President John Kennedy was one of the people in the study. And at the same time that they started the study, another group of Harvard researchers, unbeknownst to the first group, had started a study on 14-year-olds in the Boston area who are low income, who hadn't gotten into trouble. And the question that study was supposed to answer is, why did these 14-year-olds not get into trouble when their peers were already in trouble? And these 2 studies got merged together. So you've got a low-income group and you've got a rather elite group. And they have been following these people with interviews, questions, blood tests, physical exams every 2 years for the duration of their lives. And since then, they've enrolled the spouses into the study and the second generations. But one of the questions that comes up over and over again is, what makes people happy? And what the study found is the most important thing that makes people happy is having many meaningful social relationships. Not only was it the most important thing to make people happy, but it also correlated with better health and increased longevity, something that was totally unexpected. They also found that most people in the study, as long as their baseline financial needs were met, more money didn't make them happier. There have since been other studies that have refuted that in a subtle way. It turns out if you are very unhappy and you are not earning a lot of money, if you earn more money up to a certain level, you get happier. Earning more money doesn't make you happier. For everybody else, it turns out there is a slight increased risk of happiness as they earn more money. Physical fitness is an important component of happiness, and having a purpose and meaning in life is an important component of happiness. Now, many of you are probably saying, what's the quality of my social relations? I'm not going to spend any time on that, but I wanted to give you a link and understand what your quality of social relationships are. All of these links in here are in my slides, and at the very end of the presentation, there'll be a URL. If you click on it, you can download all the slides, and they're all hyperlinks. You just touch them, and you'll be able to see the links. Everybody knows people who have quit their jobs and then went back to work. Now, some people go back to work because they decided the finances really weren't what they thought they were, and they needed to work. When you start digging down, the real reason they went back to work was that they missed the people, their friends. Men generate their friends through things that they do together, what is called side-by-side friendships, work-related friendships, people you're playing tennis with, who you go bowling with or hang out at a bar with. And then there are another type of friendship that's called utilitarian or instrumental friendships, where you help each other on tasks around the house. Whereas, so they're all sort of activity focused, whereas women just sit down and talk. They have face-to-face relationships. Now, when men leave their work, they lose many of these friendships that they had developed from work. And then they piggyback on their wife's social relationships for entertainment, and that creates other problems. So losing friends for men is a very important problem on retirement. There are lots of other studies looking at happiness, these components of having a purpose in life, social interaction with others, not only increase happiness, but reduce the severity of illnesses, the consequences of severity. The second study there, which was a 34-year study, found happiness correlated with social activities, religion, and reading a newspaper, but inversely with watching television. Now, changing gears just slightly, there's an author, Arthur Brooks, who writes a lot for The Atlantic on happiness. But what he talks about in one of his essays in The Atlantic is maintaining social relationships requires work. It does not happen spontaneously. And as he said in his article, it requires a level of work usually reserved for optimizing finances or a career. And most people just sort of go into retirement and think it's all going to happen. My experience, which may or may not be broadly applicable, is I spend time on my calendar almost every day, adding things to it to make sure a week, a month, 6 months from now, I have things to do. It doesn't happen spontaneously. One of the other points that we know that leads to happiness is doing volunteer work. And there are real physiologic changes that can be measured in people who are doing volunteer work. There are real health benefits. The caveat is the volunteer work has to be done altruistically. If you're doing the volunteer work because your spouse says, go out and do work in the soup kitchen, and you're like grumbling, it turns out those people don't get better health benefits from that activity. But if you're doing it altruistically, it does. A quick comment about dementia. And this was an excellent study published in JAMA, which looked at a lot of different variables. And they found that there were certain activities that people could do to reduce the risk of dementia. Now, they didn't have a huge impact, but it had about a 10% reduction in the risk. And those activities would include things like writing letters, journaling, using the computer, taking educational classes, playing games, cards, chess, crossword puzzles, craft work, woodwork, metalwork, painting, drawing, reading books, newspapers, magazines, watching TV, listening to music or radio. Watching TV and some other studies have correlated with depression. So these are things that you can do in your retirement that will have a salutary impact. And in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see the incidence of depression by decade. What I just laid out, the data says makes people happy and have a happy and fulfilling retirement. But there's the other side, the subjective component. From the day I retired, I kept an online diary, my retirement diary, which is on my blog. And I would write about what I did almost daily, sometimes not. But in it, I would also write things that I thought were important, like, I did such and such, and this made me really happy, and I'd highlight that in green. And then when it came time to really figure out my retirement plan, I went back and looked at all the stuff that was highlighted in green, and I saw a pattern, which I wouldn't have seen had I not kept the diary. And the pattern for me was, if I got some exercise, that was a good day. If I learned something new, that was a good day. If I had some form of social interaction, that would be a good day. Unexpectedly, if I made something or created something or repaired something, that made me feel better. And the other thing is an absence of what I call non-productive stressful activities. There are certain activities that I know engender stress in me. Talking about the healthcare system, to me, is a dead end that just ramps up a whole lot of anxiety from what happened when I left because of that moral quandary I had. Talking about politics with somebody who has a different view of the world than mine, well, I know we're not going to come to an agreement. I try to avoid that. It just makes me unhappy. Now I sort of identified what is the objective data, the scientific data that leads to happiness and a better life, and then the subjective data. And just to review, the objective data, which is probably applicable to most people, is I need to expand my social circles. I need to engage in physical activities. I need to engage in intellectual activities. I should engage in volunteer activities with the caveat that I have to do it only if it's altruistic. And I need to ensure I have a sense of purpose or meaning in my life. Those are the objective things that probably apply to everybody. The subjective, which only apply to me, is I need to avoid needlessly stressful activities. I need to engage in a creative activity. And one of the things that came out of my diary was I want to explore the secular, spiritual, or mystical world. That turns out to have interest in me. And I wanted to live more right brain, more creative, emotional, artistic, and less of the left brain, the analytic and the scientific, which has been my entire existence up until retirement. So those items are my strategic plan. Now I need a tactical plan. What am I going to do to make each of these things come to fruition? So the first thing on my strategic plan was I needed to expand my social circle. So what have I done? Well, in the beginning, I went to Somerville Counseling on the Aging because we live in Somerville, and I attended their weekly senior walks, and I attended the men's monthly talk group. Turned out, although I did those for a while, though I'm not doing those anymore, those don't work for me. Some of the things that I have done that have worked so far is I created a Rembrandt's group, Retired Elderly Men's Brunch. We meet once a month. Some of these sessions are really helpful. We talk about interesting things. I made it a point of attending the MIT Club of Boston social events and lectures that basically ticks two boxes, the social part and the intellectual part. I created at our house a weekly, what I call a shoot the shit salon. Thursday, I send out an email to the neighborhood group saying, Gail and I are going to have a weekly shoot the shit salon, 5:30. Come if you want. We'd have somewhere between 1 and maybe 6 people show up, and we would just talk. Gail and I would provide fresh cut up fruit and vegetables. Some people would bring beer for others, some would bring wine, but it was just a time to talk. And sometimes we had really interesting conversations, and sometimes it was just how your kid's doing, forum that created a sense of community, which is so important in retirement. Then there's the train experiment, where social scientists took people as they were getting on a train, and they were divided into 2 groups. One group was told, we're going to interview you at the end, and that's all they were told. The other group was told, we want you to engage in a conversation with the person you're sitting next to, even though you don't know them, and we're going to interview you at the end. And what they found at the end was the people who forced the conversation said it made the train ride immensely more enjoyable, and that they were going to make that a habit going forward. It just created this social connection. So I made it a point to talk to strangers, people who I normally wouldn't stop to talk to, and I found it really productive. I also tried to create a pickleball league for alumni at MIT, and I think I'm there. It's not happened yet. I've been working on it for a while, but this will be something that's going to happen, say, on a Tuesday morning from 9 to 10:30. It should be mostly retirees just because of the time of day it is. And it's going to be a non-competitive pickleball league with the idea that it creates a social network. And there are other things that I either have tried to work with the Central Square Theater to create a monthly or bi-monthly play reading group for amateurs or actually people who know nothing about the theater. And the artistic director is interested, but they got other projects. Maybe they'll come back to me on that in the future. There's a book I read called How to Know a Person, The Art of Seeing Others Deeply and Being Deeply Seen by David Brooks. Great book, which gives you a step-by-step guide on how to talk to people so you have more meaningful conversations. One of the things that came out in my studies was the intergenerational interaction is really very important for the elderly. And it turns out it appears to have significant benefits in terms of cognitive outcomes, social outcome, and health-related outcomes. Now, the caveat is this is very soft science. And it wouldn't surprise me if there's a bigger study years down the road that said, nope, none of this has health benefits. But this was a review of 44 publications. It was a meta-analysis, and 22 of them found these benefits. The others said there was no benefit. So somewhere between it's harmless and it's helpful, but there was no downside. So the first thing I said was the social interaction. I tried the first 2 things and it didn't work. Failure is nothing to be embarrassed about. You talk to anybody in tech, They've failed many times. And these are quotes from famous people. The one I like the best is Leonardo da Vinci. If the above effect is not obtained, waste no more time on it. Second thing on my strategic plan was physical activity. So the tactical plan on this was to do physical activity, which I already do. I typically cycle or walk an hour and a half or two, pretty much every other day. And one of the articles I came upon was the health benefits of being out amongst greenery. It's not really clear why, but there are real health benefits in terms of reduction of obesity, mental health, birth outcomes, cardiovascular outcomes, and mortality. And these were two very robust studies that found the same thing. For my activity, what I do is I cycle the Minuteman Bike Trail. We start in Davis Square, follow it out to Alewife, from Alewife through Arlington, through Lexington, and then out to Bedford. It is a spectacular ride. You've got trees over probably 75% of the ride. So even if it's 80 degrees or 90 degrees outside, you're in the shade the whole time. And there's this lush greenery that flows by that seasonally changes. It really is a spectacular jewel. So I do that regularly. The next thing was engage in intellectual activities. So, you know, we go to the MIT Club of Boston sometimes. A lot of them are Zoom sessions. There are lots of learning and retirement groups like this. Tufts has one, the Regis College, Harvard has one. The Cambridge Center for Adult Education, I took a journaling class in. They have a fantastic resource catalog, and I would encourage you to look at that. And there's Harvard Extension School. And there are online classes. TED.com, which is a great series. Typically, they're 15 or 20-minute talks on subjects. Masterclass, which you have to pay for. They could be a 20-minute class on a cup of coffee or how to make pancakes the right way by some chef somewhere. Two, I took a class on meditation, which was 21, at least 1 hour sessions teaching you about meditation. EDX, openlearning.mit and Udemy are pretty much academic courses that the public can take for free, or if they want a certificate, there's a small fee. And if you're really working for a degree, it's more expensive, but they're for free. And I've also joined the MIT Writers Group, which is a once a week meeting, a Zoom meeting. Also for intellectual activities, I do a lot of blogging. On my blog, I have an idea.us, and I used to talk about my solutions for the political world and the healthcare world. I've stopped talking about that probably because it's created just too much anxiety. And lately I've been writing more of it fiction. And I do read books, mostly audiobooks while I'm cycling. And then I like to experiment with new tech. ChatGPT, if you haven't done it, it's free. You should just log into it and give it a try. It is fascinating what you can do with ChatGPT. And I do a lot of theater. Sometimes it's for entertainment, but sometimes it engenders these very significant conversations about what you just saw. Another component of my strategic plan was I need to do creative activities. And I do writing, woodworking, and some photography, as I talked about. And what I found, and Gail had the same experience, is inertia is something that basically holds us back from doing these activities. You know, she's got her studio, I got my shop in the basement. And a lot of times I would say, well, I really don't want to go down in the basement and spend 4 hours. And I learned how to trick myself into doing something. And what I would do is say, okay, you're not going to do a whole big woodworking shop. Just go down and clean it up. Sweep up the floor, vacuum it so you're ready next time. And inevitably, it evolves into a multi-hour session. Or I'll go online and say, look, I'm going to write in my blog. I don't know what I'm going to write. Let me just write one sentence and see what happens. Or I'll put in a sentence into a ChatGPT and say, I'm thinking about this, writing about this. What do you think? And all of a sudden, things just snowball, and I'm busy. We talked a little bit about volunteerism. It has to be done altruistically. You have to want to do it. Otherwise, it doesn't have the health benefits. And as I've also mentioned, having a sense of purpose and meaning in life are very important to people being happy. I haven't resolved either of these issues in my own mind of how I'm going to move forward on these, but these are things that have to be on my strategic plan, and I need a tactical plan for this, which I have not yet developed. I talked about avoiding, for me, I learned, needlessly stressful activities, political conversations and healthcare arguments. about the healthcare system, which I think is a mess. And I wrote about this on my blog on an essay called Moral Injury. But as I said, I'm following Leonardo's advice. If the above effect is not obtained, waste no more time on it. Just move on. Also on my strategic plan was I want to explore the secular spiritual world or mystical world. And I tried meditation and I gave it a good try. I did it for 2 or 3 months religiously. Religious is a wrong word, regularly. And it just didn't have the effect on me that I was looking for. I couldn't really tell any difference. And I think the reason is that my cycling on the Minuteman Bikeway is my form of meditation. So when I get home, I feel better. I am interested in trying hallucinogenics. And when I was growing up, I was told it would change your DNA, your kids will be mutants and so forth. And it turns out all of that is not true. Back in the early 60s, there was actually a lot of research that hallucinogenics were actually very useful in treating certain diseases. It was very useful for alcoholism, and it was used extensively in parts of Canada. And they had a success rate that far exceeds anybody else. But then when Timothy Leary came on the scene, it basically shut down all of that. And now it's having a resurgence. Michael Pollan wrote a book, How to Change Your Mind, which is about hallucinogenics. He's on the faculty at UC Berkeley. It is very well researched and a balanced view. And it talks about what we know. And he has a book out. There's a Netflix movie he put out. There's a YouTube video. And I want to try this in the future. I don't know where it's going to fall in my life, but I think it's a way of exploring the spiritual, non-secular world. I find my retirement diary is sort of helpful in this regard because it forces me to look introspectively, but there's more that I need to do on this. So, designing your retirement. Half of the population, when they go into retirement, besides having no financial plan and not really being financially ready for retirement, have no idea what they're going to do in retirement. And they just think they're going to take it day by day. That is definitely not going to work for me. I need a plan. My roadmap is shown on the right. Created a strategic plan based on my review of the literature. I need to enlarge my social circle. I need to engage in physical and intellectual activities, volunteer activities, and make sure I have a sense of purpose in meeting. And then I got to supplement that with things that are personally interesting to me or that matter to me. Then I got to create a tactical plan to implement each component of the strategic plan. And if I successfully do that, I will be happy and live as long as I'm possibly able. And if something doesn't work out, I just have to go back and iterate. And that's part of why I'm doing my diary. So as I see it, I'm going to be doing this for the rest of my life, assessing what's going on and trying to modify the process so that I have a better outcome. So I've written a lot of essays that I mentioned today and on retirement. They're all on my blog. And again, you'll have all these links if you want them. So in the beginning, I said, it is now my time. What I meant by that is that for my entire life, adult life, I was taking care of my kids and taking care of my patients. And those were my priorities. And when either called, I was there. In retirement, it is now my time to do what I want. About a year ago, my son, who lives in Napa, the one who just had the granddaughter, our first granddaughter, said to me, Dad, I want you to build me a bluebird house for my new house. And I said, I'm not interested. And he said, I need it. And I said, I'm not going to do it. It's now my time. I'm not doing it. And he kept badgering me about it and tried different tactics. And this went on for a while. And ultimately, he realized I wasn't going to do it. The baby was born. Josie was born. And he said, Dad, what happens if Josie asks for a birdhouse? And what I wrote in my diary that day or a couple of days later is I wrote in, when Josie asks for a birdhouse, she and I will have a conversation about it. And together we'll build a birdhouse that she can give to her dad if she wants.